Peter R. Breggin, MD, is called the conscience of psychiatry for his many decades of successful reform efforts. His scientific and educational work provide the foundation for modern criticism of drugs and ECT, and lead the way in promoting more caring and effective therapies. His books include Talking Back to Prozac, Toxic Psychiatry, Medication Madness, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and now, Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety, Understanding and Overcoming Negative Emotions. Welcome to the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour.
Well, my wonderful audience, today it's the pleasure to have on for the second time in a few weeks, Michael Fontaine. He's a professor of the classics at Cornell. What in the world am I doing hobnobbing with a professor of classics and having him on the most important show that's critical of psychiatry in the world today? Well, Michael's latest disclosures have rattled me. Michael keeps track of the psychiatric literature, and he found something that had just passed me by. You know, the older I get, the more I realize it's actually impossible to become too skeptical or too cynical about people who influence the world. It doesn't matter which side they're on in many ways, whether they're on a seemingly good side like psychiatric reform and standing up to psychiatric power, or whether they're the absolute bad guys reinforcing involuntary treatment, state mental hospitals, electroshock, lobotomy. Sometimes they're one and the same, trying to hold both positions. Today is one of the more disillusioning of my broadcasts and one of the most important, I think, for people to listen to, because we're used to finding out that research promoting psychiatry is flawed, fake, often financed by drug companies or shock machines or whoever else. But it's a little hard to face it when you find out that a key piece of work in psychiatric reform was, well, I'm going to find out what it was, because I haven't read the book that Michael Fontaine has read. And what we're going to be looking at is the famous Rosenhan study. Rosenhan's a professor out in California. Michael, where was he? Out in Berkeley or?
Stanford.
Stanford. Well, the high and the mighty. I mean, only second to my Harvard. Stanford. Oh, golly. And he published a study showing that normal volunteers who went into emergency rooms and into hospitals showing no symptoms at all other than saying that they were hearing a voice saying something fairly innocuous. Michael is going to tell you all about this. And they all got hospitalized and they all got medicated. And supposedly there are really great details about how the nurses had no idea, the doctors had no idea that any of these people were fake or whatever, whereas patients often identified the people as people who really weren't in there, thought maybe they were newspaper people. And the person, as I remember, who was accused of writing behavior. That was his pathology by the hospital staff, whereas the patients realized he was probably a reporter taking notes. I mean, I loved this study. It proved everything I ever believed. And along comes an author, a book, and Michael reads it, and Michael tells me, and I get this feeling in my heart, oh, well. But then I had one other thought. And the other thought was, I had an encounter with Rosenhan. Many years ago, I debated him, I believe, on National Public Radio, where he was defending electroshock treatment. And I tried to figure out why would he do that. And I looked up more about him. And he was the author of a very major textbook in mental health psychology. He's a psychologist, not a psychiatrist. And Yeah, if you're going to publish a major textbook and want to be that kind of person, then you kowtow and you support electroshock. So maybe I should have sensed something, but it was still a shock. And so Michael Fontaine, professor of classics, shock my audience, my wonderful audience of people who are very much concerned about reform in psychiatry.
Well, Peter, thank you for having me back on. It's always a pleasure, as you know. You and I first connected, I think it was over an article I wrote in 2014 based on the Rosenhan experiment, and what I thought was a predecessor or a precursor of it 2,300 years ago in the ancient world. And so I followed this experiment in great detail all these years, and a book came out just around October of last year. I pulled up my review of it. So the book is titled The Great Pretender, The Undercover Mission That Changed Our Understanding of Madness. And the author is Susanna Cahalan, Cahalan. My review of the book is up on Psychology Today. It's called The Big Lie of Psychiatry, The Rosenhan Experiment Exposed. It's free if your audience wants to Google and see. But I called it in the review, I said, this is the book of the decade. So the author is a journalist. She writes or has written at the New York Post, an investigative journalist. And some years ago, she decided to begin looking into the Rosenhan experiment. And this book is the result of what she found. So just to remind the audience, Rosenhan died in 2012. So he's not here to defend himself. And I haven't seen the records that she relies on in the book. But she does have some screenshots of the original admissions files. I'm going to read you the quote, if I may, that I started the review with. This is from The Great Pretender. The author writes, all of the little things, the wig, the lying about his hospitalization dates, the exaggeration in his medical records, the playing with numbers, the dismissal of Harry's information, the unfinished book, his never tackling the subject again, all of this piled up. Rosenhan does not seem to be the man I believed in. On pages 269 to 70. And so as you remember the study, I imagine everyone in the audience has heard of this study. I mean, this is Psych 101. Every textbook in the world has this study in it. Rosenhan had claimed that he and a number of Confederates, 12, I think there were 12 in the study, had gone to mental hospital, said that they were hearing voices, and they gained admission to the psychiatric hospitals. And then when they got there and they dropped the pretense, they couldn't get back out again. And Rosenhan published this study in Science Journal, a hugely prestigious thing. It caused a huge uproar. There was some back and forth originally between Elliot Spitzer, who was sort of the dean of psychiatry at the time. He was revising the DSM, and Rosenhan. But it is quite curious. It made Rosenhan's career. He had been, I think, at Swarthmore College. He went off to Stanford. It's implied on the strength of this study, which he'd been teasing at meetings. And he got out there, and he had a contract to write a book based on the study, and he never wrote it. It's quite strange. My personal connection to all this is very tenuous, but I find it very interesting because I had written this article that I mentioned. I was working on in 2012, 13, 14, when I was stumbling my way completely backwards, purely out of academic interest into this whole field. And so I found this incredible sort of correlation between his study and what I found in this ancient play. And I emailed him and asked him to comment on it. And his caretaker emailed me back. He was quite ailing, she said. She said he enjoyed the study very much. It brought a big smile to his face. I quoted this in the article. And I was hoping to get a little more engagement, but then he died right after that. And so that, of course, is very unfortunate. But it turns out that's not the only time he seems to have stonewalled in the rest of his career. He never wrote the book that he got a huge advance to write. This is all in Cahalan's book, The Great Pretender. Now, why? So she goes through in the book. Let me see if I can read you a little bit from this, if you don't. Mind if I read a couple of quotes?
Go ahead.
So I say, David Rosenhan was the Stanford psychologist whose sensational pseudo-patient study shook psychiatry to its foundations. Published to worldwide acclaim in 1973, it saw 8 sane people fake their way into mental hospitals, get misdiagnosed as schizophrenic, and then have trouble getting back out. So I say 5 decades later, it's still regularly cited, taught, and invoked as proof that psychiatric diagnoses lack validity. In other words, if psychiatric diagnoses, they're baloney, or they're arbitrary.
Let me add something to this, otherwise it might be confusing. These people did not tell elaborate stories of hearing voices. I think they used 1 or 2 words, like they heard a voice saying thud, or they heard a voice saying hollow, something like that, right, Michael?
Precisely right. That's exactly right. And they made, according to Rosenhan, they made minimal changes in their life stories, just the names, a couple of other things. But otherwise, they presented as who they were, hearing one symptom. And then I wrote, in this new book, journalist Susanna Cahalan makes a strong case that Rosenhan pretty much made this all up. And what does she do? I say her documentation is rich, her research seemingly exhaustive. She thanks a fact checker in the acknowledgments. As Cahalan tells it, Rosenhan studies nothing but one lie or exaggeration after another, to wit, most of the so-called pseudo-patients never existed, Peter. These were people that Rosenhan evidently made up. There were only 2 of them, as far as she can tell, besides Rosenhan himself, so call it 3 if you like. And of the 3, one of them actually enjoyed his experience in the hospital. He thought it was beneficial, having time away. You're going to like this, Peter, because it gets you what you
Lord.
said. Peter, you got to read the book. I gave my copy away to a friend who was interested as soon as I was done with it. But get ready for this. Rosenhan lied when he wrote that the sole presenting symptom was hearing a voice say empty, hollow, and thud. That's in the article in Science. Cahalan has a screenshot of his admission file. I'm going to quote this to you. This is from the admission file. It says he, Rosenhan, well, not Rosenhan, but the name he gave, this person has felt that he is, quote, sensitive to radio signals and hearing what people are thinking, quote. He realized that these experiences are unreal, but he cannot accept the reality. He has tried to insulate out the noises by putting copper over my ears, that's a quote. One reason for coming to the hospital was because things, quote, are better insulated in a hospital, quote. He has also had suicidal thoughts. Even more than that, and the last thing I'm going to share, Cahalan discovers Rosenhan didn't gain admission to the hospital. His wife signed commitment papers. His wife had him committed.
So she's a co-conspirator.
Oh, well,
either that or he was, or either that or that's what he was reporting and experiencing. Is that the implication?
The implication is that the hospital wouldn't take him on his own word, that his wife had to sign the papers so that he would be accepted. So when he wrote that he went in and he faked his whole way in and they took him at his word, that wasn't true. It took a second person taking legal responsibility to have him committed.
Yeah, so it was still fake. That's what it sounds like. And he used her to get him in. It's a giant fraud. And his mentioning that he was suicidal, it's astonishing they didn't bring him in. So, I mean, it's the reverse story. I mean, the story is that he couldn't fake his way in even when he said he was suicidal because the doctors somehow didn't get a sense that he was that dangerous to himself. So it's a whole reverse story. So his wife then says, I want him committed. Oh, my God.
Well, that is to say, he was saying all these things evidently, but his wife is the one who finally had to sign off so that they would take him in. But you're quite right. It's literally the reverse of what that study says.
Yeah.
Literally the reverse. But, you know, this is where things get even more interesting, Peter. This is going to kind of blow your mind. So I told you that what I was quoting from you was a screenshot of that admission file. It turns out that Elliot Spitzer, do you know who Elliot Spitzer was?
It was a big name. I don't remember him particularly in some detail, but yeah, it was a big name guy.
He was the one who was at that very time revising the DSM.
Yeah.
So this is not the current iteration, but he was the editor-in-chief of the entire thing. Someone evidently at that mental hospital evidently leaked Rosenhan's admission file to Spitzer. So Spitzer knew it wasn't true. And then Spitzer began toying with him in public. Basically, I don't know that I would use the word blackmail. Cahalan doesn't use the word blackmail, but Spitzer basically seems to have held this sword over Rosenhan's head for the remainder of his career. And that would explain why Rosenhan was always so cagey about he never did anything else.
Wow.
Can you believe it? Huh?
So then we have America's most powerful psychiatrist in many ways, since he's editing the DSM, knew it was a fake and didn't disclose it because he preferred to have power over Rosenhan. Something like that.
That's pretty much what Kahlon suggests in the book, that he had his own agenda of changing the diagnoses and he wanted things to go in his direction. That's right. I can't believe, if you haven't read the book, it's a page turner like you can't believe. You'll finish the whole thing in an hour. It's fascinating.
Michael, are there kids in the background or some other noise? Just so we can identify it.
Yeah, hold on. Let me
well,
go
you know,
I
don't really mind it much. I just wasn't sure whether it was in the electronics because it.
No, it's here. But we had a deal. Let me go reinforce the deal. I'll be right back.
Folks, this stuff is. I mean, you literally cannot make it up. I'm hearing this for the first time. Michael actually told me about this as the show was starting, just before we went on the air. And so I looked so shocked at the start of the show when Michael started to talk about this stuff that he asked me, he said, did I discombobulate you? I'm sorry if I upset you before the show. It just blew me away. And it's getting deeper and worser. Human nature, I'm fond of saying, leaves much to be desired. This is a professional level. This is the pits, really. Although, still doesn't compare to lobotomizing people and shocking them, but it's just awful stuff, Michael. How did you react when you first started reading this? Did you feel, wow, I've found something wonderful? Or more like me, oh God, no.
That's right. There's no upside to any of this. Everyone comes out looking worse. And I sort of asked around with various friends of mine who take an interest in these issues. And one person said, well, a book like that should not be written because Rosenhan is not here to defend himself.
Oh, right.
I said, well, that's okay. But again, I said, there are screenshots of the file, and we have to assume that this stuff is authentic. In my review, I called on Stanford to publish it all, but they haven't done that. Perhaps they will.
That's really amazing. This guy is saying we can't write history if it offends my values. It's history.
Well, yeah.
It's history.
Yeah. Well, again, I would like to see the original documents. I really would be much more comfortable if everything were put online by Stanford University, which has them, so that everyone could see.
They have his archives with, you think, stuff in it?
That's right. And that's what Kahlon got access to and what she relies on for a lot of the book. It turns out that Rosenhan began writing, so he had a contract to write a book about the pseudopatient study, and he started on it, and he never finished it. Later, it turns out he was sued by the publisher to get the advance back. So there was a start of the book, and that's what she relies on to see, number one, that he was very lightly changing the details of his own life, but that these other people don't seem to have existed. And she puts a call out. She said, if you were in this thing, let me know. But no one.
I remember he identified some of the people. One of them was a pediatrician or something. These were some college volunteers. And the numbers changed. And also, oh my gosh, I don't think he said he was one of the volunteers. I don't remember that.
I can't remember the details off the top of my head. I can't remember. It would be worth going back.
Yeah, I don't think he ever said he was one of the volunteers, or he would have really made something out of that. So he was one of the fakes. If that part of his story is even, well, it is true because we got some of the record there.
That's right. So yeah, to get back to your question, nobody comes out looking good from any of this, right? I mean, it's not a win for any.
You come out looking good.
It is funny because, as I mentioned, I backed into all of this through purely an academic interest in this ancient place. So I wrote the article. I said, boy, it's exactly like Rosenhan's study, except that Rosenhan's study looks more like fiction. In other words, it looks like he wrote the same kind of play that the guy in the ancient world wrote.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll get to that play before we finish. And by the way, I want to take a quick break and talk about just briefly your new book. The book is How to Drink, a classic guide to the art of imbibing. Now, it doesn't say it's by you, so I want to tell folks that this drunk who wrote this book is not Michael. Michael is translating from a medieval text, 1530. Is that right?
1536.
1536. But from the Latin?
That's right. So I've got a copy here. This is the Renaissance in Germany.
Wait a minute. I've got a copy here. But my copy is signed. Thank you.
There you go. Well, thank you, Peter. Yes. So this might be a little more interesting.
And I want to come back to by the way, folks, we're going to come back to Rosenhan. We're going to come back to the first study, the first piece of fiction, one of the first ever written, ridiculing psychiatrists in ancient Greece. You got to wait for this. So, but let's look at tell us about your book a bit.
Yeah, so here it is, very briefly. You got to be careful because anybody who writes about praise of drinking is doing something very risky, right? People say, the guy must be an alcoholic. But this was 1536, and this I recently rediscovered. I was rooting through hundreds or thousands of dusty old books, and this is a self-help book, not a 12-step program to stop drinking alcohol, but it is written for young men of college age because in these very years we saw the birth of binge culture being accepted. So the behavior that's so familiar on college campuses, going in and drinking 8 or 10 shots in a row, passing out, all the problems that go along with that, that seems to have started right around this time period. So if you go further back to the ancient world, or even certain countries today, people don't do that. If you go to Italy today, the young people might have a couple glasses of wine, but the whole society enforces, keeping alcohol within moderation. So this guy was he was the principal of a high school, of a fancy-dancy high school in Germany, near Nuremberg. And the young men back then were training to be knights, with plate armor and all that sort of, but there was no use for that way of life any longer. The armies didn't really use that style of soldier any longer. So these guys were trained in a hyper-masculine fashion. They had no outlet for all that aggression. And what seems to have happened is they were turning to drinking wine competitively as the proper way to compete. And so
they couldn't even joust instead? I mean...
They did. Actually, they did. The German fraternities, they did joust. So there were actual fraternities at the universities back then. This is 500 years ago. Yeah. And so we can see the origin of sort of beer pong and all of these competitive drinking games where you're trying to make the other person pass out. And so the book is fascinating.
Being at Cornell, you would know a lot about that.
I know nothing about it, Peter. Nothing at all. And so but he wants young men to stop this kind of behavior. And he's saying you have to learn to drink alcohol responsibly. And it's very, very funny, very witty. And he sort of takes you through all the paces. And so it's just a tremendous read. And anybody who, I'm always very careful when I talk about the book, anybody who is only familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous and their approach to total abstinence will be surprised by this. But I certainly would not want to ever imply that there's anything wrong with Alcoholics Anonymous for people for whom it works, right? Because for some people, it definitely does work. He just has a different way of looking at the world and a different way of discussing it.
Yeah, well, in Great Britain still, I think that in other places, abstinence, such as we advocate in the U.S., through AA at least, is not the standard. I mean, drinking in moderation becomes the standard. So, but I think AA does a lot of good things, but also it isn't the only approach by any means.
And here I compared it to, I said, what is the opposite of sleeping around today? In the United States, the opposite of sleeping around is not celibacy. It's monogamy, isn't it, right? I mean,
right.
It's committed
moderation.
Moderation, that's it. It's so boring, but it's so true.
Michael, I'm enjoying this interview so much. I'm not going to do my usual introduction with, so I wanted to say a few words about that. I'm going to publish this whole interview without me having a 10-minute intro to it. And so I want to just pick up and thank PRN FM, which is where this show appears on the radio on Wednesdays. And I want to thank them very much because they've allowed me to both have my radio show and have my TV show. So the show goes up on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. live, and then it goes into an archive in radio. And then we put the show up ourselves on my YouTube channel. And we've been doing this for a few months, and it's going well, and it's very interesting. And I'm still playing with the model for it now that I've got this wonderful TV setup. And I am doing lots. I do want to say one thing. For those of you who are interested in the coronavirus, our coronavirus resource center is just amazing now. And by the time this show comes out, we're recording it on the 8th, and the coming Wednesday, May 8th, 2020, will be coming out. I'm going to have stuff up on the YouTube about the betrayals from our federal government, from NIH, the likes of which you've never seen. And that will be coming out before before the show airs. So go back and take a look at it, but you can just always keep up with what we're doing in this regard by going to the Resource Center. And no, I haven't given up on psychiatric reform. We will continue working in that area. But I think right now, all Americans, we need to do whatever our part can be to help folks understand what's going on. So, Michael, is there more to say about your book? Or should we go on to fill out more about Rosenhan?
Let's talk about Rosenhan and the study and things that interest you or may interest the audience, because I think that has a certain immediacy, doesn't it?
But this is very immediate too, because this is the original drug that human beings have used going back to the ancientest times. I think this is the first drug. It probably comes before herbs in the literature, at least, that we have. And
I'll give you some, this will be of interest to some people. It's a little trivia question. When Noah got out of the ark, after the whole world had flooded and killed everybody in the world, what line of business did he go into? Do you know this, Peter?
No.
He became a winemaker. He decided to plant a vineyard, which on the one hand is sort of an origin story for wine, because it goes as far back in history as we can go. But then Noah starts drinking too much of it. And he gets quite drunk, and he gets naked in his house or his tent.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
And so it is also a story, sort of on the other hand, the oldest coping mechanism, not necessarily a good one. But as you're saying, right, this is the oldest drug.
Yeah, and also, this is interesting, such an old story of the shame that people feel about some of their shenanigans when they're drinking. But
he talks about that in the book here quite a bit. So the author is talking to young men in particular, and he says, you're going to do things now you'll be so ashamed of. Not only will you not forget, but nobody in the community is going to forget either.
Yeah. And you know, that the dreadful thing now is that some of the worst things human beings do are now under the influence of psychiatric drugs. And we've always known that many cases of violence, particularly domestic, personal violence, not organized violence, not planned ahead mass murders, they rarely have anything to do with alcohol. Alcohol particularly affects short-term experiences of violence, fighting in bars, coming home, kicking the dog, hitting your wife or your children. And then this is maybe an interesting point for people as an aside, whereas mass murder, where you've got to be planning and thinking, it's not just outright impulsiveness, it gets into delusions and hallucinations and other things that may be influencing you. That's almost always psychiatric drugs. Sometimes it's just psychosis, but a lot of the time the psychiatric drugs and so many different kinds of them, not just the antidepressants, but you can get violent on anti-Parkinson drugs because they stimulate dopamine. It can happen on the drugs we take to treat nicotine addiction and withdrawal, but stimulant drugs that we give to children and adults take. And there's just all kinds of drugs that can, even some antibiotics that can cause violence. If they cross the blood-brain barrier, they start mucking around with your neurons. So while alcohol is a source of a great deal of interpersonal, abrupt, impulsive, losing temper kinds of violence, psychiatric drugs are a great cause of the more organized and often mass violences. It's fun to just go back and forth. I hope folks find this kind of a conversation interesting. To me, it's amazing to be able to have you here talking. And so more about Rosenhan, more about alcohol. Where do you want to go, Professor?
Well, in either direction. It might be of interest to some of the audience to hear about the play that I've talked about.
Yes, let's do it, because we're at the half-hour mark. Let's get to the play.
Sure. So just to remind folks, I'm a professor of classics, which means study of ancient Greece and Rome. And that, if you pull out a timeline, takes you about 2,500 years into the past. That's where the sort of high point is. And my specialty is Latin literature. Latin was the language spoken in ancient Rome. And in ancient Rome, about 2,200 years ago, the main form of entertainment was to go see a show at the theater. And there was a sort of Shakespeare-type comedian back then named Plautus, or Plautus in English. And he wrote a comedy. It was translated from an earlier Greek comedy about 100 years before. He wrote a comedy called The Menechmus Twins, or The Menechmus Brothers. And it is a comedy where you have identical twins, two identical twin boys that are separated at birth. This is the foundation of like every psychology study, right, Peter? And so identical, like the big Minnesota, they're separated at birth. And the first one is named Menechmus, the older one. He wanders off at a festival with his father. He gets kidnapped and sold to another family, and he grows up in a different city. And there's another brother, the younger brother, I guess a minute younger, named Sophocles. And so when the first brother is kidnapped, the parents rename the second brother in honor of the first. So now you have twin brothers separated at birth with the same name. They grow up in different cities, and the day of the play, the first brother has been decided, they're about 30 years old, he's grown up and he decides he's gonna go all around the Mediterranean Sea looking for his long lost brother. And lo and behold, the day of the play, he arrives in the city of Epidamnus, where his long lost brother has grown up, knowing nothing whatsoever about his brother. So this is the basic plot outline of the Comedy of Errors for Shakespeare. So Shakespeare himself read this play, thought it was very funny, and adapted it. But what's of interest for us is that in the play, as you might imagine, what makes it so funny is these two guys, the twins, are never on stage at the same time. And they have the same name. So the first one comes in and there's a whole bunch of interactions, and then he leaves, and then the other brother comes in and all the characters think it's the same guy, of course. And he says, well, how do you know my name? Why are you saying I did these things? And so it's a source of endless confusion and a lot of jokes. But as the play goes on, it gets darker. And finally, the resident brother, the long lost brother, he's a lawyer. He's had a rotten day at the office, and he had an appointment to meet his mistress that didn't work out. So he comes home and he's all ranting and he's angry and he's lashing his arms in the air saying, what a horrible day. I can't believe this. And he starts getting berated by all these people who say he's been doing terrible things all day long. And he loses his temper. And he starts to, and his wife gets angry at him because she thought he's done all these things that he hasn't done because he was in the office all day. His brother didn't. And she gets so disturbed that she thinks he's getting violent. And so she summons her father, the father-in-law. And the two of them together, they decide that this guy is mentally ill. And they're going to summon a medical doctor to deal with him. Does that sound familiar? The family relations getting involved? And So they bring in, sure enough, a doctor comes along. And this is ancient Greece. The play is set in ancient Greece. So that's the birth of scientific, evidence-based medicine. And this is really important.
Hippocrates.
This is Hippocrates. And this doctor is clearly a Hippocratic doctor. He goes through a diagnosis of his patient. And the questions he asks, a scholar figured this out about 75 years ago, very ingeniously. The questions he asks and the order he asks them, they mirror exactly what a Hippocratic doctor would ask. And so this guy is being presented as a science-based physician. And as you might guess, every sign of anger, impatience, umbrage, anything is regarded as a sign of mental illness. And that's the word they use, morbus. The Latin word morbus means illness.
Wow.
And how do you
does it have an adjective for mental?
No, not there. But there is a point where one character says to the guy, he says, I think your brain is out of order.
The brain.
Your brain is broken.
Folks, it goes all the way back to the doctors. They didn't know anything, but they made up it was physical. Oh, God.
Well,
my profession. What a distinguished background I have in the medical profession.
Well, you need to read literature. Everybody should read literature. I should read literature, yeah. So how do you think the doctor decides to treat this guy?
Electroshock, they didn't have drugs.
No, they didn't have electricity back then, just the eels swimming around the water. No, but they decide to use drugs. And so the doctor says, not to the guy, not to this patient.
Just like today.
But to the father-in-law. He says to the father-in-law, I'm going to give him a course of hellebore. Now, hellebore seems to have been the ancient psychotropic medication par excellence. That's what's always associated with the various mental conditions in the ancient world, whatever this stuff was. But of course, the guy himself, he keeps protesting he's not sick. And so he doesn't want to take medicine. And so the doctor says, well, I'm going to get these 4 strong guys from my clinic to come and get you. And we're going to bring you back to my clinic and we'll keep you there for a couple of weeks. And we'll give you the course of hellebore. And so it's exactly, that is, he's getting committed against his will. And so they come to get him. These strong guys come to get him. And the only reason it fails is because the manservant of the long-lost brother suddenly comes in and he sees his master being taken away and he fights him off with a sword. It's very dramatic. It's very comical. But so right in the middle of this very funny comedy, you can detect very clearly this is a serious social critique. Mm-hmm. That's what the playwrights in the ancient world did. They weren't just there to make a buck or to entertain and make you laugh. They were there to critique society. Maybe not in every case, but certainly in this one. And you can see the critique. This is how somebody who's not comfortable with this medicalization of the situation is trying to get the audience thinking. So it's tremendous. And if you go back and you read Rosenhan's article in Science, this is what I did in a research paper. And by the way, I reposted it on Psychology Today. So anybody who goes to look for the review of The Great Pretender, you can just click right off to the right. The paper is there. This is now out of date because I haven't had a chance to mention, the bombshell revelations about Rosenhan. But I showed how you can line all this stuff up. And Peter, this is 2,200 years ago that this critique was there, 2,200 years ago.
Well, go on with the story, because as I remember, it gets more and more interesting.
Well, yeah, so what happens in the end, of course, is the two brothers, so the manservant fights them off, fights the sort of the goons off, and away they go. And then the two brothers reunite. They see each other. And it's very, very funny. One's on one side of the stage and the other's at the other. He says, well, who is this guy? He looks like my mirror. And so the servant runs back and forth saying, what's your name? Where are you from? Where were you born? And then the two brothers reunite. They decide that they're going to run off together. The guy living in Epidamus hates his life. We were talking last time about the status of women. It ends on a very misogynistic note. He says, I'm going to auction off all my goods, including my wife, and we're going to get out of here. So I mean, that's not the kind of joke that ages very well. It tells us, I think, more about the audience back then.
Yeah. Was it an all-male audience?
One of the most debated questions in scholarship. We don't know. I sure wish we knew. It does appear that women went to the shows in Rome, but it's not 100% certain. And of the women who could go, it's not clear how many did go, or even how many people went.
Yeah. Now, Michael, I remember something more from when you first told me this story about what happens to the doctor. Am I mistaken in my memory? Was I just fantasizing that he gets really indicted in some way as the one who's crazy?
No, so there, I think you're thinking of something else I published recently. You and I were talking about. So, can I fast forward everybody up to the Renaissance again?
Yeah, okay, but let's finish that first. So what's the view of the doctor we end up with?
So that's where the audience is expected to think, right? The playwright is not making it obvious. The playwright shows you a scene that would scare the willies out of you or me if this were to happen to either of us. This is a guy who cannot win. The situation imposed on him makes it inevitable that he's going to be diagnosed as crazy. The doctor himself seems to be a victim of the situation, the playwright is saying. The doctor is told that the guy is sick. Don't you have a type, what do they call it in medicine, the type 1 error and the type 2 error? Do I have this right? That a doctor is, can you explain that to us?
No, I can't.
Well, the idea, right, is that a doctor is more likely to call a healthy person
sick. Yeah, the problem with involuntary treatment is that the error you don't want to make is the one that ends up where you're responsible for letting somebody go who's violent. So you go to protect yourself.
So this is the idea, right? So in this play, the doctor himself is a victim of the situation because he's brought in and he's told this guy is sick.
Yeah.
It's the doctor going to say, I mean, and then he goes through, it's quite interesting, he goes through a diagnosis. He says, boy, that's not really a sign of the usual illness. It's not really, that actually sounds kind of reasonable. But then he doubles down. He says, no, this guy is sick. He needs help. We better intervene right away.
And the help is very, very violent. And many people listening to this Dr. Peter Breggin hour today, which I don't think I mentioned it was, in my excitement over the bombshell you dropped on me about Rosenhan, they're going to have to experience this. I want to stop for a minute and just think about that. There are people today listening to this who have had 4 strong people hold them down, and usually only takes 2 when they're big and strong and you're scared and not a fighter, and have been injected with a drug that sounds very similar in name, Haldol. And I wonder if it was a play on that, but no, it's a play on haloperidol, but God knows where that came from. This is very, very serious. And many people who watch my show or listen to it or read my work have actually been through this. And I've seen it done when I was a resident in psychiatry. I never participated in anything like that. In fact, I never let it happen to any of my patients. I would have stood there like the guy with the sword and said, you're not going to throw my patient to the ground, and just, tried to help my patient change his behavior so he could stay out of trouble. And I actually intervened in situations as a resident where I explained to the patient that if he kept acting the way he was, I would have no control over what was done to him, and he really needed to get his act together, and we'd work out something, and so that I could discharge him and get him out of the dangerous situation. I mean, I knew that, these people that I was dealing with weren't dangerous; they were in danger. So this is actually a pretty solemn moment, actually, for I think a number of people watching this. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you about that. That's the key in the play yet again, right? The threat of danger. This guy is characterized as dangerous. Remarks that he makes are not necessarily threatening objectively, but in the situation in which this guy is involuntarily thrust, everything is regarded as this guy is dangerous, right? And threatening. And I wonder, so I agree with you completely. I wrote this in the article.
Little has changed in psychiatry. In this regard, nothing has changed in 2,200 years.
The dynamics of the situation are so familiar. I agree with you. I say it's a comedy, and people are meant to laugh, we think. But right in the middle is this horrifying moment. And you're quite right. For anybody that's experienced this, it must be terribly traumatic to even read it. But I wonder, Could there be a therapeutic value in groups reading the scenes of this play? People may be talking about their feelings if they identified with each character. I don't know if you'd say that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Well, it could be. I mean, that's just up to people. I don't play that paternalistic role, but I do know that this show could be therapeutic in the sense of helpful. I mean, who doesn't want to know that what they were subjected to was not personal? They didn't deserve it. This has been going on since the deepest times, the earliest medicine, where doctors had the authority to do things to people in a gross way, and to make up theories that it's in the brain and call it an illness because they're doctors and they want the power, and they don't know what they're doing. Nobody. I mean, the whole idea of America, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is that no one should have the power that psychiatrists and other physicians and healthcare providers have when they have the ability to involuntarily commit or certify people. You can certify, in most states, many different kinds of authorities, police, sheriffs, doctors, can involuntarily certify somebody into a hospital for a day or two, during which time then the doctors go through a civil proceeding in court, not a criminal proceeding, which has protections, but a civil proceedings, and you can be committed, and you can't win a civil proceedings because the doctor's there looking almighty and smart, and you're drugged and scared and overwhelmed. You don't have a good lawyer at all to protect you. So this is a deep and profound thing we're talking about. It's so ageless.
And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of, it goes around in circles, doesn't it? This sort of thing. I mean, people keep, the problems don't go away, but the solutions keep coming back to the same starting point, or so it seems when you look through history. One thought I'm having as we're talking about this, I made this point in a number of contexts, maybe to you before, but do you know if you asked a Hippocratic doctor within the body where the problem was coming from, do you have any idea what the doctor would have said? What was the causative reason?
Maybe spleen or liver rather than
right.
brain at times.
Yeah, they believed in humoral imbalances.
Yeah.
Basically, they had humors, which are biochemicals, right?
Yeah.
But
I thought you were asking me what the organ was, and I think they've taught the spleens, the liver were producing these things.
That's right, because they believed in different biochemicals coming in the body, and they needed to be in balance to produce, the harmonious, regular.
Yeah, because we're doctors, we don't know nothing. But you read other philosophers in ancient times, and I'm sure they're attributing a lot of this to other things, to the gods, to spiritual states, to and so on. And in fact, we know that from Oedipus.
Well, there's still. Can I expand on that point for a moment? I wrote an op-ed about this. I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago. Some people got a bit upset at it, but I made the point that in ancient Greece there were 3 ways of sort of looking at these problems. The Hippocratic doctors thought it was humoral imbalances. Many people, I think, thought it was the gods getting involved. But the playwrights of ancient tragedy thought it was social in origin. They thought it was people trapped in loveless marriages. The classic example would be Medea. So Medea is a tragedy by Euripides in the late 5th century BCE. She's an immigrant woman. She marries a foreigner guy. He brings her back home. And when they get to the new city, he runs off with another woman, leaves her and her kids behind. Yeah. And she can't cope. And the end of the tragedy is terrible. I think maybe we talked about this last time. Even.
We did a little bit, but go ahead.
But so my point here is simply that the playwrights don't blame anything in the body for her misery. It's not in the body, and it's not the gods that's making this poor woman so miserable. It's her life that's making her, the choices.
Including her social status as a woman. I mean, it was a play about the abuse of women in some ways, and in some ways not.
That's right. It's the lack of autonomy. She can't make her own decisions. She's trapped. And so the playwrights of the ancient world were very much humanistic in that regard, right? They wanted to know what leads to eccentric behaviors without invoking the gods and without invoking brain diseases or imbalances and that sort of thing.
Well, there was psychological and spiritual.
Yeah, that's right.
Psychological. Now, you wanted to tell me something more, tell our audience something more that I don't know if you still have that memory association. And I interrupted you, and we're just having this wonderful conversation.
No, I'm happy. What I wanted to remind you of is, and you share this, I think, with your social media. I published another column in Psychology Today in February. It was the 500th anniversary of lobotomy. And people say, lobotomy? No, that's only 100 years old. Well, it turns out I discovered that in the Renaissance, there was a satire in which there was a guy who was being uncooperative. He had all these sort of undesirable personality traits. So these people wrote a comedy satirizing him for being a heretic. And in it, they summon a surgeon to cut him open and to ablate, to cut out the character flaws. So they want, and it's horrifyingly, it's amazing. So I linked to some recent articles that suggest that, in China, it appears that people are beginning to perform lobotomies. Again, they have a new name for it, but it seems to be the same basic procedure of operating on the brain to control behavior. I always tell people, I don't know anything about how the brain works. I certainly don't have the medical training to pronounce one way or another, but I am struck by the similarity in this play. And so the historical record suggests that lobotomy as an idea started as a joke that was later taken seriously.
What does that tell us about my colleagues? We have two things to think about. One, from earliest times, thoughtful people like playwrights thought psychiatry was a joke and a danger. And now it turns out that psychiatry listens to the jokes and develops treatments from it.
Well, so here's the thing. So the satire was published in 1520 in Germany, and then it was forgotten for centuries. And what I discovered is that the satire was republished the very same year in 1520 in Germany. It was called Eccius Dedulatus, which I translated as The Blunting of Dr. Eck. And it starts with this man who, he's difficult. And so the surgeon performs the surgery on him. The play was a satire on the Reformation, but after it was originally written, it was lost for many centuries. Nobody remembered this thing at all. And it was suddenly republished out of the blue in 1890, I think it was 1890, in Berlin. And you say, why then? Who decides to republish?
That's around the same time they were doing lobotomies in Switzerland.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, they did only a few, 3 or 4 or something. Yes, in a private sanitarium. I remember that is my work, looking at that and pulling that stuff out. Yeah.
And what does that suggest? That somewhere, some humanist was seeing these surgeries and thought now is the time to republish this satire. And so there's nothing in the book is explicit about this, but you say, why would anyone dust off this centuries old ancient text? The thing was like 375 years old. You say, why would you do this? And it was published in Berlin, the very same place where these findings were presented. I think there must be a connection, but I don't see any way you could ever prove it.
Fascinating. I am learning stuff hand over fist today, as always. Wow. Folks, this is Michael Fontaine. And he is actually a friend here in Ithaca, New York. Of course, nothing he says reflects the opinions of Cornell University. I'll tell you a funny story about Cornell. When I used to appear much more on major news before the drug companies were allowed to advertise after that, once the drug company started advertising on major TV, it kind of cut any criticisms out of major TV of the drugs. I would go to Cornell and get filmed for, say, being on Fox News or being on some morning show or whatever. And behind me was the Cornell emblems and a picture of Cornell, the backdrop. And I came in one day and the backdrop was no longer there. I think it showed a woods or something very neutral. And I learned that Peter Breggin, when the news companies paid to have Peter Breggin use the studio, there'd be nothing in the background to identify who's coming from Cornell. So, folks, I have earned these kinds of enemies. I don't resent them at all. It's just a sign that, gosh, I must still be having an influence. This is a wonderful show, Michael. Any one-sentence thought, or should we just wave our hands and tell folks we love them and we're glad to be talking to them?
That sounds about right, Peter. It's always a pleasure talking with you, exchanging ideas. I really enjoy it.
Oh, I enjoy it tremendously. And I do want to say that you should give up this false humility where you're not a doctor. Remember, it was the classical playwrights who had the deepest understanding. So I think that the classic scholars may also have the deepest understanding along with those they're studying and know more about what harming the brain does to the human spirit than doctors even today know. And that's a blessing to have you. Thank you, Michael Fontaine, author of a translation of How to Drink from 1536, I believe.
That's right.
Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye now, Michael.
Bye-bye, Peter.